Welcome to
the North Carolina Film Fiends Podcast.
I'm Oshun Jean.
I'm Knox Berenger.
I'm China Blackwell.
I'm Aya Halawani.
And I'm Alicia Burns.
Today we'll be talking about Uncle Yonko and The House is Black, comparing the two, talking about their technical and conceptual elements, what elements they share, as well as what makes them individual. I feel like I personally got like silly old fool vibes. Very, very whimsical. Very like not too worried about what's to like very day by day.
It's got a very lighthearted tone, and that really plays into the sense of like family and community. It's also very colorful, very warm.
I feel that Uncle Yonko emphasizes light over shadow, and that gives it more of a warm and brighter tone. And the colors work in a similar way, and it adds to that whimsy and that youthfulness that the film has, and it makes both the characters and the setting a lot more inviting.
Connecting back to color, I mean, there's a lot of, obviously it's like very bright and whimsical. There's a lot of props that are very colorful. The scenes where they have the cutout heart and it's like a clear film of different colored hearts, it just feels so playful. It feels very DIY, like it was put together with friends and family, and that it does reflect the community that actually exists in the film.
We talked about how it was more like an interview kind of style, and it was less like informative, it felt, than The House in Black, but there was more audience interaction, which also added to the playfulness that comes with the visual style, I felt.
And I think that getting to hear from the filmmaker at the end of the film kind of wraps it up in a nice way, sort of puts a bow on everything.
I agree. I think it sort of highlights the humanity. I mean,
Yeah.
we learn a lot about Uncle Yonko, but it's nice to hear her side and what's important to her and why she wanted to tell his story. And so it feels very personal.
And moving on to The House is Black. Visually, The House is Black works in almost the opposite way, emphasizing shadow over light. It gives the film a more serious tone, which matches the subject matter. Not that Uncle Yonko isn't serious, but the two are different. And the black and white filmmaking style in The House is Black kind of removes any of the fantastical or inviting feelings that we may have seen in Uncle Yonko, and it makes it appear more visually strict. Makes it less fictitious and more informational, and sort of brings a brutal realism to the subject matter in the film.
Focusing on that, the use of the word brutal, I really enjoyed the like brutal and visceral scenes that got up and close with the condition, because I feel like a lot of, even like in Hollywood or somewhere else where this movie would have been made under different circumstances, other filmmakers wouldn't have given the viewers that challenging image to look at and really take in its entirety. And it highlights that these people should be seen and deserve to be in front of cameras and be acknowledged as whole people.
Yeah, it's very humanizing, and I appreciated that, even if it wasn't like the most like pleasant thing to watch. Not because like the visuals were unpleasant, but just it was much heavier at the time. But I also think like it's good representation.
Yep.
It's valuable.
With the structure and this tone of The House is Black, I think that the absence of music and like just the different sounds they use, like them like singing and dancing and just talking in the classroom, it just makes it seem like more surreal, and it complements like the documentary style. And like the narrator, I think like her talking in the background was a really good choice, because it helps it flow too, and just like talks about the different struggles that they might go through. And
Simplicity makes room for the monologue, which I think is really thematically important. But the sound is done really well, despite not like being very natural.
And I also think like it's like super long, drawn out cuts where it's like only cutting at the very end of like this scene after like 5 minutes of looking at the same scene.
Yeah.
You feel it really hones it on that like just fly on the wall feel, where you're looking at like this very distinct community that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise.
Yeah, and that's why I feel like there's an emphasis on nature, because we see a lot of nature in those long shots.
I also think like even this film being in black and white, it already gives it like, it kind of sets the tone for it, because I feel like it contrasts from Uncle Yonko, like it being colorful and stuff, and this being in black and white is kind of like talking about a more serious topic, so you could just tell like the difference between the two.
It takes away a lot of the brightness, not having as much color or like warm lighting.
Yeah.
And I think that matches the tone really well. It's a really sad film. There's a lot of talk about like ugliness and sadness and wickedness, and I don't know, it's very heavy, and I think the visuals match it very well. And then in that monologue, like, she's talking about the nature of the lepers, and she contrasts that with like physical nature in the world. She compares herself to birds a lot, and that sort of explores like lightness and freedom, which I think is very thematically important for the way that the leper community lives.
Also going on based on how they live, they also have a big discussion of religion within the film and how they use it to get by their everyday lives, and it's a really big part of their culture. And I think it really gives like a sense of humanity to them as they like believe in this, and they all share that one thing, and they think that God created them as they are, and I think that's really comforting.
For sure, yeah. There's a big emphasis on being accepted as God made you. It's very beautiful, and it is very comforting.
Okay, moving into comparing both of them, I feel like for me the biggest theme within these two that we're covering is community. Uncle Yanko and The House is Black really like inexorably intertwine community and family in a way that like is distinctly non-American. That felt very challenging and interesting for me as an American viewer to see, because I feel like they use them in an interchangeable sense, like how Uncle Yanko isn't really an uncle, but he's kind of is like Unc, like he Unc for real, like he's not an uncle but he's Unc, and like it really makes it takes a village actually mean something to me, like to actually see it in practice, like actually a greater amount of people taking care of each other was very heartwarming generally in both films.
For sure, there's such an emphasis on shared community and like having a space for like people of all kinds and all ages. There's an emphasis on caring for each other and respecting each other as you are. They're two very different films, but when you frame them through this lens of community, they have a lot to offer even if you didn't enjoy watching them necessarily.
Also, I think the fact that they were both like marginalized communities, like how Yanko had said, like the Greeks, they were throwing people in jail if they were like free thinkers. I think that also helps show like the theme of community, how they all like come together to go against this oppression that's being placed upon them.
Yeah, I think, and you had mentioned a quote about birds earlier, and I have it here, and it says, "Alas, for the day is fading, and even the shadows are stretching, and our being, like a cage full of birds, is filled with moans of captivity." And I think this moment is really interesting because it acknowledges their situation of captivity, and that the community that they're in is not one that they chose.
Right.
But through the film, there still is a sense of honest community and working together with other people. And although it's not something they have chosen, they have built a real community. And I think one of the strongest themes that ties these two films together is their representation of the unseen voices and the unseen spaces, as well as everyday people maybe would not have been able to interact with Uncle Yanko on his floating home or the residents within the leper colony, but the films kind of dissolve the barrier that keeps us from seeing those spaces and those people, and the barriers are both physical ones as well as sort of stigmatic ones, which keep us from interacting and thinking about these people. And I think that's kind of the purpose of these two films, is breaking down that barrier.
Yeah, you mentioned like how the leper colony, they don't really get to choose where they are. It's sort of like the community was built sort of out of like a background of violence and hatred. Like they were shunned from society. Like they don't have a place to go where they are necessarily accepted. And so there's an emphasis on like accepting the way that you are, and I think that's really important. The film is like very much a celebration of life and love and art and each other, and I think it uses community really well in that sense.
Thanks for listening!